Okay, my name is Leonard Snyder.
What's your relationship to this area?
Okay, my family came here, the Baileys came here right before the Civil War. We've been here ever since. My great-grandfather, Milton Bailey, was in on the founding of Chautauqua, and with the Reverend Flood formed the Chautauqua Daily Herald. We've got letters that he wrote from Chautauqua in 1872 before Miller and Company came there. I've always loved history. Across the street from Chestnut Street lived the Kneebanks, and there was a connection with the Kneebanks and Bob Jackson, and whenever he came down the street, we knew he was coming. All little kids had to line up to see the big Packard come down the street. So Bob Jackson then was a hero. I mean, we knew about him well before the Supreme Court days. He lived on the corner at Fairmont Avenue, at the corner of Hanford Avenue. My grandparents, the Baileys, lived right next door. The properties were big, and they had a full-time gardener that they shared. He'd be some days at the Jackson's house and some days at my grandparents' house. So we were going back and forth at that time. I can remember, it was always Bob Jackson. It was never Mr. Jackson, never Robert Jackson. It was always Bob Jackson. And I can remember his wife. I can remember him.
Just stop for a second. Describe him. If you had to close your eyes and describe Bob Jackson.
Well, one thing, he didn't smile much. I can remember that. He was extremely good looking, even in the eyes of a kid. He dressed very nicely. You never caught him in Levi's or dungarees, and he had a presence. Mm-hmm. He wasn't scary, but he had a presence about him.
And the kids were Bill and Mary?
I can't remember the children. Isn't that funny? When we went up there, it was every Sunday up there, and I have no recollection of the children. How old would they be today? I am 72,
and I'm getting in the early 80s.
So they might have been a little bit
They've been to school.
Older, yeah, but I can't remember them. And you know, I'm getting back an awful long time. The only thing that I can remember clearly is when the Jacksons got a new type of fire extinguisher. Up till then, they were those brass things that hung on the wall with a red hose that came out, you turned upside down. This was something new. And my grandfather, B.M. Bailey, and Bob Jackson got behind his house and lit a small fire. They're going to try out the new thing. And before that, we had fire trucks up there trying to contain the fire because that thing, we should have had the old brass thing with the red hose on it. My uncle was Ernest D. Leet, Ernie Leet, and I went camping to Canada with him every year. He was just a wonderful guy. And he was Jackson's partner in the law firm of Jackson, Durkin, and Leet. And even as a child, I had enough wits about me to always wonder how a Democrat like Bob Jackson and a Republican, and I mean a really Republican, I think he started the Young Republicans Club here, could be in the same law firm together, but they were. And when Bob Jackson moved away, then the Kneebanks left Chestnut Street and moved up into that house. And there was Jim Kneebank, and we've been friends ever since. He died just very recently. So about the only thing I can add is that when he lived in Jamestown, he was a presence. It didn't take the Supreme Court and to make him as big as he was. And I've always been interested in history, and to think that we had somebody from Jamestown, New York, this community tucked away in the Alleghenies in western New York State, who produced a man who tried all the Nazi monsters is more than I can comprehend. There was Goering, there was Himmler, there was all of them, and he did it, and I think it was an awfully hard job. I don't think he lived long afterwards.
Dad and a man named Price and a man named Eklund started making floor mats out of automobile tires. And I was 10 years old on December 21st when I was out in the evening about 20 below zero, walking up Fairmont Avenue towards Lakewood when we came to Jackson's house.
Where was that now? What was his address?
Right there on Fairmont Avenue, just across from Chicago. The big pillars on it. And I rang the doorbell, and when the lights were on, naturally everybody says, Bob Jackson's home. That's the phrase around here. So Maid came to the door and she said, are you one of those kids from the school that's annoying us all the time, selling us tickets and so forth? No, I says, I want to see Mr. Jackson. It's a personal matter. What do you mean it's a personal matter? Well, I says, you tell him it's a personal matter. It's Louis E. Kelly out here. And I handed her my calling card. It said, Louis E. Kelly, salesman for the Wherever Mat Company. And so Bob Jackson was in the living room with his wife Irene, and they heard me arguing with the maid. So finally he says, Helen, let the man in. She says, he's just a little boy. I said, no, Mr. Jackson, I'm a man, I'm a salesman. So I had a sample of a floor mat, and I told him about it. And at those days they had cocoa mats that made from the skin of a coconut. And the bugs would get in there in the spring and it would rot out by September. So I told him this was made out of automobile tires, and I told him the benefit of it. When you stepped on it, any mud on your feet would go down through the seams. So he said, that looks like a good thing. So finally, I measured the front yard, or front entrance, and it took a 36-inch mat for his front door and a 24-inch mat for the back door. And Mrs. Jackson says, well, now, Bob, we've got Christmas coming. It's December 21st, so you've got Christmas coming. I said, Mrs. Jackson, that's why I'm here, to get money for Christmas. And so we started in, and he said, all right. He said, I'll take both, the 36. So I had to go across the street. My dad was selling on the other side of the street. And they came over, and he got me the mats. I went in, and they were heavy. I was 10 years old, and I was a little boy. So I got in there, and he paid me, and I thanked him. I left. So then I went to Bob Jackson's house in the late spring when he was home on vacation from Washington. That was about the beginning of 1930, about the summer of 1933. And I showed him the polishing cloth. Boy, he went for those. He says, I can use this on my saddles. You know, the old saddles had a lot of brass and metal. And so I sold him a couple. And believe it or not, the next Christmas when he came back, he called my mother and said he wanted me to bring up a dozen more. So then the next summer, he called my mother and he says, I want him to come up to the Lakewood riding stables. And I went up there, and during the Depression days, there was a lot of these people around unemployed, you know, looking for a job. Anyone in government office, they'd just dive on them, you know, have them see if they couldn't get you a job. So I got to the guardhouse there. They had it all fenced off because Bob had a lot of notoriety in those days. People thought him a great man. So they called up on the phone, and he says, that little Louis, he always called me little Louis. He says, if that's little Louis, send him up. And other people says, how can that little kid? One guy even says, that's a little snotty-nosed kid. How did he get in the scene? So I went up there, and he shook hands with me, gave me a big hug. And so I showed him the polishing cloths and sold him 2 dozen that time. Boy, 2 dozen. $6 a dozen? That's $12. I was rolling in the clover. So he said, you look like you're thirsty. So he bought me a Coke. They didn't have Pepsi or any of those other things in those days. He bought me a Coke and a hot dog. And so then, believe it or not, he said he admired me for my grit, the way I was arguing with the maid that day over not getting in the scene. And he says, I'll give you 4 letters to use in your life. And he said, you'll find out it'll work good. So he said, take the 4 Ds. You have to have desire to want to be something. You have to have the determination. Come hell, fire, and high water. These are his words. Be determined. Then you have to be dedicated to your work. And then you have to be self-disciplined. So you have desire, determination, dedication, and discipline. That was 1933, and I still use those same 4-letter words when I'm talking to young people today, telling about that. Right here up until Bob Jackson died. And then I had an appointment that day in Erie at the General Electric plant. But I went over, took care of the problem they had on the conveyor belts, got the problem solved, gave back. And just as I got back here, you had some men in the commandery that was honor guards. I wasn't able to be there, so I wasn't honor guard. But one man got sick I don't know what happened, some type of a minor ailment. And so then I finally went up there and I helped out in the commandery there, the group there. So I was fairly close to the 8 justices. I don't think I was ever in somebody told me they took a movie of it or something, but I don't think I was there. But I cried like a baby. I just cried like a baby because he was a great man.
At some point along the way, though, your paths did cross with
Right.
Jackson.
When I was 19, there was an ad in the paper for the FBI, and so I decided I applied for it, and they sent me a telegram telling me to come down, and I think we went down in January. I started January 19th, and I was just a file clerk.
And 19th, this would have been what year?
43. Yeah. We decided that she would like to come down for Armistice Day. She wanted to go to Arlington Cemetery. So I invited her down for a week. So she was there for a week, and while she was there, she called Irene, Robert's wife, and said she would like to see Robert. And Irene said, oh, we would love to see you. And she said, just go to the Supreme Court building and walk in the front and take the first aisle, hallway to your left, and at the end of the hall, turn right, and it's the first door on the left. So we went into the Supreme Court building, and there was a huge, big security officer standing there. And we just walked right past him and followed the directions and ended up in his outer office. And the secretary, she was a little surprised, but when Rosie told her who she was, she let Robert Jackson know that we were there. And he was with some gentleman, I don't know who, and he dismissed him very shortly. And we were only in the outer office a few minutes, and we were ushered into Robert Jackson's office. And Rosie and he talked a lot about Uncle Dan. And I remember Rosie asking him if he liked his job on the Supreme Court. And he said, oh, very much. And he said, I don't like politics. And he asked me how I liked working in Washington.
So was that the first time you'd met him?
That was the first time I had met him.
Mhm. If you had to
But-
close your eyes, how would you describe him?
Like my Uncle Dan. He's a very friendly person, even though, you know, I felt I was just taking my sister to the Supreme Court to talk to Robert. He made a point, you know, to talk to me. He was very friendly.
So what happened after that?
Oh, and so he told us that he was due to go on the bench, but he would have a page take us on a tour of the Supreme Court. And so we went on a tour where the normal public doesn't see. I remember going into this dining room, and they had this huge long table, and it was beautiful.
Did you have any reason to go up and watch the court in action?
No, we didn't. I don't know. For some reason, we didn't do that.
So how long was your stay there at the Supreme Court?
I think he must have talked to us about, I would say at least 15 minutes.
Do you remember the secretary?
Yeah. No, I don't. I'm sure Rosie remembers her name. But she had been from Frewsburg. I remember that.
Her name was Ruth Sternberg.
Oh, uh-huh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Carl's brother, and you were just commenting a little bit that in your life paths crossed with Jackson.
Very slightly. We lived here from 1931 to 1940. In the winter of 39 to 40, I was working at the YMCA after school. They had a massage parlor, or whatever it's called, in the basement, and I worked there after school. And one of the people who came there is Robert H. Jackson. And he was very reserved, very respected people. And so I just happened to meet him. And that's one of my cherished memories because he is such a great person. He was such a great person.
Describe him. You know, as he walked in,
He's shorter than you would normally think, about my size. And
that is how big?
I'm 5 feet 6 inches, and he was probably an inch or two taller than that. Very, very gentlemanly. Did not speak very much, but reserved person. And even then, I knew who he was and respected him highly.
Did you, well, at that time, he would have been, 1939, he would have been
Attorney General?
Attorney General.
Yes.
And during that period of time, actually wrote the opinion which permitted Franklin Roosevelt to do the Lend-Lease without going to Congress. And did you get a sense, did you follow him as he was going through Nuremberg? Where you were in your stage of life, did that mean anything? Did you follow it in the newspaper, Jackson at Nuremberg, Jackson at the Supreme Court?
Yes. Then I knew who he was and had a picture of him, so that was exciting to have this small contact with him.
John Peterson, and my father was Marvin Peterson. He was president of the Crescent Tool Company. And in that position, relative to Justice Jackson, Justice Jackson was my father's lawyer, both personal lawyer as well as the Crescent Tool lawyer. I only know probably 2 stories that come from my father. Story number 1 is that I remember being home one time and Dad came in. He said, "I can't believe this." He says, "Here I am just chatting with Justice Jackson, and the president calls up, and here we are in Jamestown, and the president is calling one of my friends, Justice Jackson, and the president says, 'How are you?' And Justice Jackson would say, 'Hello, Mr. President.' And Dad couldn't believe he was in the same room as somebody talking to the president so directly.
Now, this would have been in the House?
This would have been in the Jamestown offices.
Okay.
And probably the more important recollection is the story, very coincidentally, Greg Peterson bought the house that we used to live in Lakewood, 4 Winchester Avenue, and the story there is that Justice Jackson would visit our home from time to time, although I never saw him personally. But he slept in a room where I used to sleep at 4 Winchester Road, where Greg now owns, the house that Greg owns. And I remember Dad bragging about, "Do you realize who slept in this room? Justice Jackson slept in this room." Of course, at the time, that didn't mean much to me now, but it does then, but it means a lot to me now. And so I passed this story on to Greg, who apparently enjoys Justice Jackson's company in that particular room.
How long did your dad own the house at 4 Winchester? What was the time period?
The time period was about from 47 to maybe 66.
Dad's relationship with Robert Jackson is what?
First cousins.
First cousin. So, Robert Jackson's father, William, would have had, Charles Jackson, would have been a brother, Charles Jackson's brother, right?
Yeah, their fathers were brothers.
Father's your brother.
My father's father died when my father was only 6 years old, so he hardly knew his father.
Okay.
Teen.
You're born 1918, and when Robert Jackson, well, what recollections do you have as growing up in the 1920s?
The main thing I remember about going to Robert Jackson's house there in Fairmount, the White House with the pillars, was that I was a little girl and I rode horses. That impressed me. That stuck with my memory. And I remember seeing Robert and his family when we'd be at Helen Adams' house or at Lina Stickles, his mother.
I guess it was Friday night, yeah, in Utica. And the president of the state association was the postmaster of Utica. And I went in and presented my wrench. Yeah, my golly, these wrenches are all over. Say, young fella, you've done quite a job here. I said, yeah. I said, we're hoping that you'll vote, your organization will vote favorably to come to Jamestown. Then he knocked me over. He said, well, I'm sorry to tell you, but I'm not going to have anything to do with it. Neither is my group. I said, you're the State Association of Postmasters. But he said, this year is the year we are nominating President Roosevelt for the second time. Well, I said, who is going to be the poll? James Farley. Jim Farley was the right hand of President Roosevelt. Did you ever meet him?
Never met him, but I read about him.
Oh, boy, what a man. So, here I was in Utica. My wife was with me. She was tired out. So the Empire hadn't come in yet, so I got her on the Empire and sent her home. And somebody picked her up at Westfield, I don't know. And I started with that package from Utica to Washington, D.C. And I got in there at night about 8 o'clock, a little after. And I called Shoreham. And that's where Bob Jackson lived. And Mary, his wife, answered. I said, Mary, this is Charlie Laycock. Charlie, where are you? I said, I'm in the Ambassador. She said, what are you doing in town? I said, I want to talk to Bob. She says, well, he's got laryngitis. He's laid flat with a blanket over on the Davenport, but come on out. And she always used to make a piece of cherry pie out of heaven. She always had a hunk of cherry pie for me. It was so good. So I went to the sheriff, and here's Bob. What do you want? I said, Bob, I've been all over the state, and I'm promoting this postmaster's convention. Another crazy idea. He said, Charlie, what are you doing bringing a bunch of Democrats into that hellhole of Republicans? No, he said, it'll never work. I said, Bob, I'm going to give it everything I can. Now, I said, all I want to do, I want to get to Mr. Farley, the Postmaster General. He looked at me as though he was a jackass. And I felt like a jackass. Well, he said, I don't know. He said, Charlie, you do the craziest thing. Well, I said, Bob, we want the business for the hotels because
This was the Hotel Jamestown.
Huh?
The Hotel Jamestown?
Yeah, both of them were owned by the Andersons. And we had discovered the improvement of the highways between Erie and Buffalo. The salesman would drive down here and get his orders and never come in our hotel. So we blew $5.75 room charge. And that same thing with Erie. So we had to counter in some way. That was a business matter. Well, he said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to stay at the Ambassador. I want to see Jim Farley. Well, he said, I don't know. He said, go ahead and go to the Farley. But he took one from Jamestown. One of the secretaries, I forget her name.
L.C. Douglas?
Huh?
L.C. Douglas?
No, another one, too. An elderly lady.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, I went back to the Ambassador, stayed in the room. Finally, about 11 o'clock, Monday morning, the phone rang, and I picked it up. Charlie, what are you doing in town? And I said, well, I'm trying hard to get a convention. Yeah, I heard about it. Well, then she told me that Farley was in New York on Monday. wouldn't be back in Washington until Thursday. Charlie, what are you going to do? Do you want to come back? I said, I'm going to stay right here. You could see Farley Thursday afternoon on a platform, and I'm telling you, the most welcome I've ever had in my life, in all the big men I've had to meet, General Motors and Ford and all that I've gone through. He got off the platform, put his hand out. Well, glad to see you. Convention? What convention? And then Ambrose interjected. He said, well, General, he, after doing promotion for the Postmasters Convention, which is meeting in May in Jamestown, New York. Where's Jamestown? Where's Jamestown? I had to tell him it was just south of Buffalo, you know. Well, by golly, that sounds pretty good. Can you accommodate them? Oh, I said, we've got 2 big hotels, 885 rooms, and we'll be, and most welcome they'll be. Well, I don't see anything wrong with that. You, Ambrose? He said, I'm in favor of that. Woo! So I just quietly took it, and finally, when I got through, here's what I did. I personally invited James Farley, the Postmaster General, to come to Jamestown. And that's what Bob Jackson never would believe. But I right out came, I said, General, would you mind considering coming to Jamestown personally for this convention? Well, he said, Ambrose, mark it down, this sounds pretty good. He said, yeah. And doggone, he came.
No kidding.
He came. Well, in addition to that, Babe and I are out in the kitchen, my wife, talking to Max Valley, because that banquet was over 700, and that ballroom is limited to about 700. And you go beyond that, you got trouble. We've been talking to the chef, and we were coming from the kitchen through the dining room, and over here sits James Farley and Bob Jackson. So Bob said to me, hey, Babe, come on over. So Babe answered it. She walked over, and he said, Jim, he said, here's the brains of the convention effort. Babe, his wife, Laycock here is just the mouth, that's all. Don't pay. So Jim spoke up. He said, hey, you made a bet. No, but then Bob did bet me in Washington that he wouldn't come. And I took the bet. So he was paying off the bet. So Jim Farley remembered he talked to him about the bet. So he paid off the bet. So Jim Farley didn't drink or smoke. Another cup of coffee. Bob had another cup of coffee. Babe, what did you have? Well, she said, Bob, I had coffee with a chef out there, but just give me a small cup. So coffee. I stood there, never said a word. So finally, Jim Farley looked at me. He said, hey, Bob, what about Charlie here? He said, gosh, he's done all this work. Oh, yeah, give him a glass of milk, and that's what I got. But John Wright then, I'd made him aware of it. We'd wired all that second floor, and oh, we had a tremendous layout. And every room we had was solo, packed out, and there were beautiful people.
You did these various jobs. How long did you work at Blair? You must have been there
It
for
was 10 years,
10 years?
10 years.
And during that time period in the 20s and maybe early 30s, did your paths ever cross with Robert Jackson?
Well, yes, just the one time
Mm-hmm.
we were invited to this party that was in honor of Mr. Jackson. And I think that Mr. Blair had something to do with that. I'm not sure whether he was, whether he had someone with him at the time, but I just remember we were in the ballroom at the Jamestown Hotel, I believe. And he was the other end of the big room, and looking over the people. I think they were dancing. That's about all I remember.
Did you get a chance?
Seeing him he's standing there with his wife beside him, and just looking at the people, watching the people.
Tell me about Robert Jackson.
Well, the only time I ever really met him, it was at a dinner party given for the Italian consul.
Mhm.
And he was my dinner partner.
Ah.
And we did the usual chit-chat, you know.
Mhm.
And I was a little nervous because, after all, he was quite a famous personality. And besides that, I was going to have to say a little something welcoming the other man. But during our talk, you know, he asked me if I was going to do trial work. And I says, I would love to do it, but I'm scared at the idea.
Mhm.
He says, if you remember one thing, you'll never be afraid. I said, what? You go in there with the truth, and you don't have to be afraid of anything. I never forgot that. But he was very pleasant, and it was a nice dinner. But that's, as I say, that's the only time I ever met the man or had it to do with him.
What was your impression of him, just as an individual? He walks into the room. That you'd seen pictures of him.
No, he didn't throw his weight around. He just sat there, and of course he was asked to say something, you know, but he didn't long-winded or anything like that. He was just very pleasant, just a short speech, and he was very nice to everybody around him. So I think everybody had the same idea that he was a very nice person. Yeah, and that's the only time I ever came across him. I never met him after that, anywhere.
Was there much talk about him in Jamestown when he was at Nuremberg or on the Supreme Court? Do you remember?
He was a very famous personality. In Jamestown, I have every right to be proud of him. Yeah. And to me, he was a brilliant man. Yeah. Or he wouldn't have got as far as he did.
That's right.
Yeah. So I was very pleased to have at least known him for a short time.
Attractive personally,
Right.
and he could talk on his feet. He didn't have to stop and think about what he's going to say. It just came naturally for him to speak right out.
Right. And Ernie, how long was Ernie with Bob Jackson?
Well, he was there until after Bob went to Washington to be with Franklin Roosevelt,
Right.
but the rest of the firm all stayed together, including Ernie.
What was the name of the firm? It was originally Jackson. What else was it?
Gerald Herrick
Right.
and John, I think his name was John, somebody Durkin. Jackson, Herrick, Durkin, and that's right. My memory's very bad.
It's very good.
Well, I can remember things back then, but I can't remember what happened here last week.
Well, I can't remember what happened yesterday. Now, you say you lived next door,
Next door to Bob.
so you knew Mrs. Jackson.
Yes, Irene.
What was she like?
She was awfully nice, just as nice as she could be. I think she objected to Bob spending so much money on horses because he rode a lot. And she said, well, if we ever go to the poorhouse, we'll go behind a good horse. she was a very nice woman, and she didn't look at all like the woman they had in the movie.
Right.
Because she had black hair, and I understand the one in the movie was blonde.
Mm-hmm. Democrat? Jackson?
Yes, yes. And my husband was just as ardent a Republican.
Years later, did people wonder how they got along?
I don't know. They got along. Anybody could get along with Bob. I don't know how they got along. They must have gotten along because Ernie was still there when Bob went away to Washington.
Right.
Maybe I ought not to tell you. But Bob kept him. He had a good car, and he had a garage just back down the street from his house where he kept his car. And he came out of there in the winter time in deep snow, and he got stuck in the snow, and he tried to get the car to move, and the car wouldn't move, so he got a line of cuss words that I never have heard before or since. And he kicked that car for all he was worth. He kicked the tires, and he went around and kicked the other tires. Cussing loudly all the time. my room where I lived in my house just gave out on that street, so he was just outside my window when he did all that cussing. He sure did.
Do you remember any other anecdotes about Bob Jackson? That's a very good one.
No, I don't remember. He had, I used to go over there to dinner. Now and then we went to, maybe it was no, it wasn't Thanksgiving, but anyway, we had roast turkey. And the girl came in carrying a turkey on a big silver tray. And she stumbled over something and tipped the tray, and the turkey just shot right across the floor. She went over and picked it up, put it back on the platter, and put it on the table in front of Bob. Everybody laughed. That was good for a laugh. Nobody cared.
Yeah.
Of horses.
Yeah.
He rode a lot. In fact, the first time I ever saw him, before I knew who he was, but I was out horseback riding with a friend of mine whose father owned the stables up at Lakewood. So he picked out nice, gentle horses for these two kids who'd never ridden before and sent us off on the way. And first thing I knew, this man caught up with us. And he says, "Hello, girls, I'm Bob Jackson." He says, "How's the riding?" And that was the first, I knew who he was because I'd seen him, but I hadn't met him before. The people that I got picked up by Bob Jackson.
Paths crossed with the Jacksons.
Well, when we first came to Jamestown, we had a little house on Fairmount. And of course, we went to Fairmount School, the grade school. My sister became a good friend of Mary Jackson, and Billy and I were kind of friendly enemies. You know, it's over 75 years ago. And it gets a little hazy in my mind, but I know that that Delano Roosevelt was the governor of New York State, and I believe that was sometime in the late 20s, as I recall. And that kind of pinpoints it. I remember back of the Jackson home on Fairmount, there was a kind of a wooded area, and the little boys would play there. I think we were probably in the age of somewhere between 7 and 9 years old, something like that. And I remember one particular interesting thing. Mr. Jackson, of course, was the Democratic power here in this part of the country, and he had a party for Governor Roosevelt. Now, this was back during Prohibition time, you know, and Billy and Jimmy and Mary and Jean were in the kitchen, and the drinks were, and I think they were serving cocktails because Billy and I were drinking the dregs out of the little tiny glasses. We didn't know quite what it was, but we knew that it was something that we had to investigate, see? So we did. And Billy and I were tent mates at Camp Anyasa. Back in those days, Anyasa was a tent camp and kind of run like with some touch of military to it. The little boys had to make their beds and line their shoes up, you know, and keep the tent floor clean, and it seems that most of the counselors were college football players. And we played softball and archery and tennis and canoeing and all that stuff.
Right. Now, tell me about Robert Jackson. Did you guys have any impression at that time?
Well, yes, I remember seeing him riding when we were out playing, you know, in that wooded area. He'd be horseback riding in our area. But that's about all I saw of him.
Living in Frewsburg at the time, what was the reputation of Robert Jackson?
Well, I didn't know too much about him, but I knew when I came back to Jamestown to teach, I saw him coming down the street. I knew instantly who he was. The black coat, the black hat, and I thought, I'd like to tell him I'm Bertha Page's daughter. But I thought, this is March, terrible winds, and I dare not do it. So we passed, and that was it.
Grandfather had the blacksmith shop here at the intersection just across from the Walrod property here. And he done a lot of blacksmithing, and the one time that we remembered of going up to Robert Jackson's to shoe the saddle horses, which Jackson lived on the Fairmont Avenue, and then there was a side street there, and the horse barn was down in back of the house. And I believe that he was scheduled to be up there at 9. Well, we was a little early, and in the barn he had a watchdog, and when Robert came down to the stable, Grandfather had the horse pretty much shod, and he says, "Shorty," he said, "how'd you get in this barn without getting eaten up?" "Oh," he said, "no problem." He said, "I just got a little of this here real soft hoof that's in the horseshoe box," and gave to the dog, and he said, "You know, from then on we were friends." And he went in and got the horse and had it shod, I guess, by the time that Robert got down. And he was sure surprised to know that just a little horse hoof would make friends with the dog.
Observations and experiences with Jackson. I remember one time I went into the old Bank of Jamestown on business, and George Niebank, who was a very close friend of Robert Jackson's, was in there. And as I went through the doors, here was Robert Jackson and George Niebank walking towards the rear of the bank, and they were directly in front of me, and here they were, these two very dignified, broad-shouldered men, very close friends. They were walking towards the bank, and I assumed at the time that they were going back to have a little chat in one of the conference rooms in the bank.
When did you start at the bank, Bill?
In 36. Yeah, I worked there for over 5 years. At that time, too, of course, Jackson was counsel for the Jamestown Telephone Company, John Wright, and which is a rather important job. I'm not saying that, which is a well-known fact, I don't think Jackson died being a very rich man, but he always had important positions in the government and locally and so on. And I said, Ruth, when you were in Washington, how did you address the justice? Did you call him Robert or Mr. Justice or what? And she had a very short reply. She said, I called him Bob. And that was it. I thought that was very interesting, because a man of his stature, and of course I know it was a very close relationship, but to just call him Bob, and that's the way he would have preferred to have been called.
Originally, I was born and raised in the west end of Warren.
Okay.
And that's how I happened to meet Sam Bonavetta.
That's right.
And of course, the funny part about it was, I'm going down the steps, coming out of the courtroom, and here's these guys who I'm not paying attention to going up. And all of a sudden, I heard somebody say, "Oh my gosh, it's Bobby Swanson from Warren." Well, of course, when I heard that, you know, I turned around because there was a bunch of GIs going in and out of there, as far as that part goes. I turned around, and all of a sudden I said, "Somebody say something about Swanson?" He says, "Yeah, Bobby." He says, "It's Sam." He says, I got somebody I want you to meet." And I said, "Oh, who?" And he laughed. He says, "Justice Jackson."
I'll be darned.
And with that, this guy walked over, put out his hand, he shook hands, and he says, "Well, if you're from Warren, then you know where my hometown is." He says, I'm from Frewsburg." And I said, "Oh, was anybody left after you left?" I said, "Was there anybody left in the town?" And we joked a little bit. And I said, "You know, I've been reading a lot about you, Justice, in the Stars and Stripes." And he says, "Yeah, but," he says, they make it sound like I'm somebody important." He says, "I'm really not that important." He says, "But anyhow," he says, "as long as you're from Warren," he says, let me say my name's Bob Jackson." And oh, he was just such a pleasant person to talk to.
Right.
And of course, call it hero worship or whatever you want, but hey, this man has been written up so much in Stars and Stripes, not only in Stars and Stripes, but in the newspapers here in the States. And because he, as I remember, I may be wrong, but as I remember, he was already a Supreme Court justice.
Correct.
And but boy, there was just nothing but just a fine person. That's all I could think of when I met this man.
With, of course, Bob Swanson, I had known Bob Swanson from grade school, you know, probably from the time he was in second or third grade, you know, and we grew up together in the West Side. And you know, and everything was really somewhat informal from the standpoint that if you knew somebody or you ran into somebody that you knew that was from your hometown or whatever, it was like you were long lost brothers. You know, this was the way it was. You know, with Bob. So.
Was it a chance encounter?
Yes, it was really a chance encounter because you know, I happened to see, well, as you're walking along and you see a group of fellas that are just like you see in this picture that are looking over, you know, they're all dressed up in uniform, they're on guard duty and everything, and he was on duty, and you know, you look at somebody and, hey, I know him. That's Bob Swanson. You know, that's a type of thing, and I just happened to be at the time with Justice Jackson. I can't even remember what we were talking about, you know, and we were chatting about Warren County and Jamestown, you know, at the particular time, and that's when we ran into Bob, and I just introduced him. Yeah. But you know, it's just like really, and Jackson, he didn't put on any airs or anything. He was friendly as could be. Just like running into somebody, the same as the way we're sitting here at the present time. Yeah. You know, it was just, you know, one of those things. You know, here's Justice Jackson, and of course, he knew who Justice Jackson was, of course. Sure. So it was just a friendly introduction.
You first meet him?
I first got to see him when he was, and I don't even remember what he came to Warren for, but he was already in Washington, and as I recall, at that time, I believe it was somewhere around 1941 or 42 when he was down, he came to Warren for some occasion, and that was when I first met him, and of course, you know, it was a sense of pride to be meeting someone who had attained such a high position, and here he was back in our area just to visit, and of course to be honored that he was the principal speaker.
Paths crossed again in Germany.
Yes. At the time when our paths crossed again, I had been ordered to go into Nuremberg because the group that was in effect headed by Jackson, they naturally, we have to remember that it was the end of the war. They were conquering heroes, and unfortunately, in many instances, they acted that way. Mm-hmm. And there was certain acts of depredation and that type of thing. And of course, there were all kinds of motor vehicle accidents and incidents, and in most cases, in most instances, what happened was that when I say we, I mean the American Armed Forces were at fault. Like, there'd be a traffic accident between Strassenbahn, the streetcars, and our people, and what had happened was that they didn't even bother to file any reports or anything else. And it was a position of the United States, properly so, that we had to start conducting ourselves properly and be responsible for our actions, whatever they may be. So, you know, there was instances where in some places there were, in the course of a month, there would be up to 200 traffic accidents between the United States Army vehicles and streetcars.
Through the staff, that's how you actually met Bob?
That's how, right, that's how I saw Justice Jackson, and of course, I just, the few times, you know, I met him and everything after the first time, telling him where I was from Warren, Pennsylvania, and of course, he said he had been born in Warren County. I says, oh yes, we all know that. And he just remembered who I was, and I told him that someday I'd be back practicing law in Warren, Pennsylvania. And,
What kind of guy was he? Describe him.
he was very pleasant, and he was one of those individuals that he looked the part of an important person. He carried himself well. He had a pleasant approach, a winning smile, and he was friendly, and he was someone that you felt comfortable with. And of course, you know, the fact that I was, at that particular time, I was a neophyte lawyer, was interesting to him, because he knows, I mean, he remembers what he went through and everything. And of course, the fact that even at that time, I knew of his work with the utilities and everything, and he was considered one of the best in the country, and that's why President Roosevelt made him go to Washington, and he started to move up the ladder, and knowing everything he did. Of course, I wasn't the only one, but anyone, as I say, that was from Warren County, that was overseas, we all knew everything that Justice Jackson had done. What a tremendous record he had at the time. And we had the greatest admiration and respect for him. So, you know, after meeting him the one time and everything, you know, everybody knew each other, and of course, we were all, you know, in effective service at the time, so you were saluting any senior officer or anybody. This was the type of thing that...
Did you salute him?
No, because he had, they were all civilians, so that it wasn't necessary to salute him. And he was wearing, usually, he was wearing what we called civilian clothes.
At some point, your paths, or at least crossed with Jackson or Jackson's horse?
I'll never forget the first time I met Bob.
Sure.
And I saw his picture, so I knew who he was. One time I turned around and Bob was standing almost behind me. And I just said, Bob. I never referred to him as Mr. Jackson. To me, he was just Bob, and that was it. And he never said anything different, so.
He was already in Washington, and he was in the government, or he was still living in Jamestown?
Oh, no, he was, when I first met him, he was Attorney General.
Okay.
And then, all of a sudden, there's a big headline on the picture of Bob Jackson. He was Supreme Court Justice appointed by President Roosevelt.
Now, how did you know that you could feel comfortable turning around, seeing the Attorney General of the United States, and you're you know, you're 20-some years younger than him, and you call him Bob.
Well, I don't know. I can't give you that honest statement today, but I just turned around and said, "Hi, Bob," because I saw his picture in the paper. And I'll never forget the first time I shook hands with him. That was the last time I did. Being that kind of a man in office, you know, I just give him a fishtail handshake. That was the biggest mistake I ever made, because when he come down on that, it was like a vice grip. And I went right up on my tiptoes. Boy, I was glad when he let loose. This next time I saw him, I went right straight in. "Bob, it's good to see you." I never made that mistake again. But boy, I'm telling you, he clamped down there like a vice grip. I went right up on my tiptoes.
You're a tall man. How tall are you?
5'10".
5'10". Okay. Was he your height? Shorter?
I'd say give an inch one way or the other.
Okay.
But he had this dynamic personality.
On working his horses at all, or preparing his horses?
There was a bench out on the front end of the barn there, and I used to sit out there and, you know, just watch the traffic going by, and all of a sudden the phone would ring, and Kelly would come out and yell, "Don, Bob's up in the way, get Renee ready for him." So I'd run to the box stall and get her out, saddle and bridle her. I no more had the bridle on her, and here comes Bob driving up in the car. So I'd leave her out to the entrance of the barn, and he'd be out, and he'd mount her, and the way they'd go for 2 or 3 hours, way out back.
Did he tend to ride by himself, or would he have?
No, he rode, as far as I know, I never saw him ride with anybody.
Is it Rainey?
Rainey,
And what kind of horse was that?
she was a beautiful saddle-bred horse. She was like a buckskin. Beautiful horse. I just loved to be around her, because I used to open up the box door and walk in and just put my arm around her and pet her and talk to her. I guess that's what happened when you're a horse nut.
Starts arriving one by one, and one of them is
Bob Jackson.
Bob Jackson. We haven't talked about him. Describe him.
Well, I have a hazy notion of what he was like that night, and I'm sure I wasn't sufficiently impressed with his importance that night, but I had had an opportunity to see him on other occasions, and I knew that my father admired him very, very much, and was proud of the fact that he had come from here, and that he had been, as a young man, coming to Chautauqua at various times, and that he himself had known him, but that I couldn't claim to have. Those were my college years and my teaching. I taught at college at that during those years, and so I wasn't there all the time. But I knew my father thought very highly of him, and was delighted to think that of the career that he was achieving, the success in his career that he was achieving.
So, all the guests have arrived because they were supposed to arrive. There would be nobody after the president. It would be really permitted. All of a sudden, the car comes up. Do we have any recollections?
Oh, I have a very strong recollection of that, because among my duties was to stand beside the man who was checking the names and to identify them. So that, because after all, he was I think he must have come with the president, or been somehow, or with the police people, because I had to say, yes, this is so-and-so and so forth, and they would be entered into the house. And so I was standing on the porch when this car drove up, and I saw them help the president out of the car. Nobody else could see this because everybody was inside the house. No one was on the porch except this man and myself, and they helped him out. And unfortunately, our house sets up.
How did they do that? How did they?
They lifted him up by his elbows, one on each side.
Right.
And how he arranged himself now that I have trouble getting in and out of a car, I know it must have been very difficult to arrange himself in such a way that people could get under his arms properly. But that's what they did, and he held his elbows like that. And he didn't try to walk until they got him onto our porch. There are 2 or 3 steps right by the street. Then there's a brick walk, little slopey, and then about 3 steps onto the porch. And then it would be probably 10 feet across to where my mother then stood in the doorway. And it was very interesting to see how John Barrett described his walk, because it was, I wouldn't have been able to describe it or say particularly what it was, but when I saw John showing how he had to use his hips, I recognized it. And so he walked across, but they stayed with him, whoever it was, and the 2 men, and stepped back, and he reached out his hand, and Mother opened the door, and he said, "Oh, Mrs. Bester, I do remember what a cool home you have." And of course, everybody was boiling hot, and he must have been boiling, so it was a very wonderful, typical thing for him to say, but you know, he cocks his head back and gives that smile that melted everyone. And so then he was held, and he walked that way across the little expanse, and there was an armchair for him, and he quickly snaps something at his knees and sits. And I don't know how those things work, but he did it himself, and sat, I think, a whole lot more gracefully than I can now. And then he just sat there, and each one of the people that was there was brought up to speak to him, and refreshments were served, and the men were there at the end. He didn't speak again, after all, he'd given his speech.
Right.
But he always had a word for everyone, and a lot of people, he'd do their names, you know. So he must have had a phenomenal memory for names, although somebody probably was saying them too. And it was a very memorable thing for everybody in the room. Was something very moving about admiring, or maybe not even admiring, this man, but having to admire his courage and his fortitude when in the face of such difficulty.
Did you get his autograph?
No, I don't think so. I was not an autograph seeker, but we were awfully lucky in having a lot of autographs around, because people wrote to my father. So we never asked anybody for them.
Did anybody, I'm just curious, I mean.
And some of these people knew each other quite well. I'm sure that Bob Jackson talked to the official people, and probably just the few guests that were Chautauquans would probably not have spent any time doing anything except just meeting the president and feeling good to think they had.
Knew the Jacksons, and I guess they wanted to send me away to school. So they were thinking, and being Episcopalians, they were thinking about National Cathedral.
Sure.
And so I was taken to Jamestown and introduced to Mary.
Oh, was that right?
Because, of course, Mary was going there already. Right. And I got to know her, and I got to know some of her friends, and that was how it all got started.
And then from there, would you go up on weekends and ride horses, or?
Oh, I went up one time. One time I went up there and rode with her, and she was wild.
The horse or Mary?
She was fearless.
Yeah. Mary. What kind of like?
She was a great gal. She was smart, you know. She was a smart gal, and did very well in school. And she was very down-to-earth girl. I mean, there was nothing put on about her at all. She was just a nice gal. And she played basketball in school. I don't think she played field hockey. My roommate played field hockey. I played tennis. And that was, well, she was just a great gal and did very well. National Cathedral was a gloomy old place. It wasn't dancing. I was very surprised. She really did a lot with her dancing, as you well know. But I was very surprised that she took that up. I thought she would do something, I don't know, completely different, I guess.
Robert H. Jackson was still coming up there. He'd call up there and want them to tell somebody to go out and get this boat and bring it up, so he'd have some going, so he'd come up and get on there a certain hour of the night or day, and which we'd have to go out. All the boats were moored in buoys out in the front out there.
So your job, so for example, Jackson would call the marina and say, I would like the boat ready at 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock, and yeah, then we'd go out and get it, bring it up to tie it up, so there's people out on the boat, and away they'd go, and they wouldn't be back until late at night, so the boat would be always back on the marina there, and then we would have to take it out and put it in the buoy.
The alibi itself, the boat, what kind of
It was
boat
a big cruiser, probably 34, 35 feet. As I say, at the time, my memory wasn't that good to remember, but it was a big boat. It had bunks in it and like a little kitchen and a john in there, and it was a pretty good-sized boat, the Alibi was.
Further describe the boat.
Well, it had a cabin,
Right.
and then on the back on the top, they would have like a big awning over the back part of it. So people could be out there underneath the awning, and there were seats around the back and all, what have you. So it was a good-sized boat. But we'd have, as I say, we'd have to go out there, and two of us would have to go out there. One would have to go on the boat and start the engine, you know, and the other guy would go out and untie it and unleash it. Not touch, but remove it from the buoy, and he would either bring it around or I would bring it around. We'd bring it around to the marina dock where they could be walk right out on the dock and get into the boat.
Did they have on the back alibi? Where was it?
Oh yeah, the name of it was the Alibi. I can remember that very well.
Here we go.
Well, there's a gentleman who said that he received a call from Roosevelt while he was fishing, and there was only one phone in the village, and that was at the store, so he had to go fetch him and have him call President Roosevelt.
And they called him into the store?
They fetched him from his fishing expedition to come to the store and call back, call the president, and that was a big thing in Spring Creek.
That's
Okay, Gerald Lilly, okay.
When I was a teenager, I was sent to the local store, and as I walked in the door, one of the employees asked me to move on up to the other end of the building so that Mr. Jackson came in right after I did, and they had sent for him down to camp to come to the phone. He had to call the White House. We got away to give him some privacy.
no kidding. So
That was the one.
Now, you were a teenager? About what year would this have been?
Oh, in the 1930s.
Okay. Because you were born when, Mr. Lilly?
I was born in 1922.
Okay.
And then as I was in Scouts, we had a pancake supper to raise money to go to camp, I think it was. And he was down at camp at that time, and he came and had.
Okay.
One other time, his cousin died, Lena Jackson, and he came to the funeral. And as
That was here in Spring Creek?
yeah, and Mr. Bracken brought him over and introduced to each one of the pallbearers, which was in her Sunday school class.
I'll be darned.
Okay.
I don't know anything else right now.
Is she here in the Spring Creek Cemetery?
I can take you up here and show you where she's buried.
Okay. That would be great.
This has been terrific. You had a chance to be part of a little bit of history here.
Yeah, not a close friend, but I saw him many times, yeah.
And he had here at Spring Creek, among the locals.
Well, they were proud to even see him, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And as far as the camp, when he was down, we were told, I and my brother, stay away, let him have privacy. You know.
And
So I never went down there.
Where was he camping? Where was the spot?
In the farm where he was born.
Okay.
And it's,
Down by the river or back on the...
it's across the creek.
Okay.
Yeah.
But not up on the Jackson Hill, down by
it
the...
was on the bottom. Yeah.
Okay.
He left here early in life, I think.
Right.
6 years old or something.
Right, I think that's right.
So your first recollections of Bob Jackson at age 4.5, what impressions did you have of him?
Oh, I thought he was wonderful. And Irene, as I called her then, I thought they were both wonderful. I have a child's garden of verses that she gave me for Christmas one year. They always remembered me at Christmas time. So,
What characteristics did he like to dance?
oh, I'll have to tell you about that experience. They would come out in the summertime, and they were there one Sunday night, and Irene was playing the piano, and Uncle Bob and I were out on the front porch. He was trying to teach me to dance.
Is that right?
I wasn't a very good student. I think I was stepping on his toes all the time, probably. But they laughed. Everybody was laughing at my efforts, I guess. And she played the piano beautifully. So it was just a fun evening.
Did you ever have a time where you spent the night at the Jackson house?
No.
No.
We were up there one Sunday for dinner, and I was probably about 12 years old, something like that. And after dinner, Uncle Bob said something about going down to Celeron, taking the children. They were, well, I don't know whether either one of them was preschool. I don't know whether Mary was preschool. She might have been. But we went down, and the children wanted to ride on the Greyhound. Do you remember that?
I remember seeing that, sure.
And it was a tall one.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got off from there, Uncle Bob said, well, I'm so damn glad I went. No, he said, I'm so damn glad to get off from there that I'm glad I went. And Mr. Barrett and Harold just burst out laughing because that was the funniest comment that he made. But he and Uncle John and Daddy would get together and laugh and joke and tell stories. They just enjoyed each other a lot. He was a man who couldn't stand someone taking advantage of another person. And the Nuremberg trials preyed on him terribly. Mm-hmm. And Helen blamed those Nuremberg trials for shortening his life. Mm-hmm. Because he had to hold all that anger in during the trials, and he never wanted black people to be treated unfairly.
Jackson Center. And you're sitting in a chair which has some significance. Tell the story.
Well, I have to stop and think, but it was after the Second World War, and my father, who was a good friend of Justice Jackson, stopped in when we were on a trip to Washington, D.C., and met with the justice. And while I was in the office, Justice Jackson said to me, "Do you want to go see the courtroom?" And of course, I was about 11 or 12 at the time. And we walked into the courtroom. It wasn't in session. And then he said, "How would you like to sit in my chair up there?" And I said, "Sure." And with that, I went up to the bench and in his company and sat in his chair and looked over the entire Supreme Court chambers. With that, I've always remembered it as an event that made an impression upon me at the time. So basically, that's where it was.
What was
No, I mean, he didn't have a lot of time for interacting with the grandkids, and yet, you know, I remember that incident in the kitchen, particularly where he told us, you know, look, I for one would be deeply disappointed if either of you, you know, ever get into chicanery. And the other impression I had from his remarks was, you know, you don't have to get into it either. You've got the talent, the brains to, you know, whip the crooks, and you better be doing that and not the opposite. So he was, you know, letting us know what he wanted us to be and giving us the confidence that you know, we could play that role. You know, I remember him at the table in the funny way he was holding his utensils because he had a broken arm or so that wasn't set right, you know. It's what I remember, either right or left hand. He was holding everything like this, and, you know, they were busy teaching me to eat right-handed. I'm left-handed, I always was, and I was about as stubborn as the next Jackson descendant. So, but I knew that this was not, you know, normal. So, it turns out that he fell off a horse at Spring Creek, I guess, and broke the arm, and it never set quite right. Certainly, Grandpa is trying to get me down the stairs along with some law books, some materials he's got in his other arm, and he's walking down, and I'm not under oath here, am I?
No.
So any inconsistencies between this and the written version are probably due to the advanced.
I'm under so much restrictions these videos, it's awful.
So he's walking down, and we're on the landing above the first floor, and he's turning, and
Do you have you in one arm?
yes, yeah.
The staircase has a turn, is that?
Yeah, coming from the upstairs, you're really turning around. From the second floor, you know, his study is on the, it's going to be the northeast side of Hickory Hill. He comes down a few steps, there's a landing, and then a lot of steps down to the first floor. So, you know, he gets to the landing, and one of those loads, you know, must have shifted. I'm sure it was the legal materials. And, you know, he's going down on his knees and releases me so that I will be safe. And, you know, I sort of bounce down the stairs all the way to the bottom. And he calls out, and I think grandmother arrives first, and then my mother, by which time, you know, I'm basically laughing hysterically and saying, "Toot it again, Grandpa, toot it again." So,
You took a lot of pressure off.
no, that was great. I mean,
For being so gracious.
Today you say, "I'll sue you."
I thought that
Myself in Washington, D.C. because my father was a mining engineer, and he became the assistant director of the Bureau of Mines. in a law office in Washington, and its practice was largely cases referred by law firms in other cities that had to do with the government. I think there was a Swedish girl who was working for my boss's family, who had been born in the United States of Swedish parents. They had returned to Sweden when she was very young, 9 or 10. And at the age of 21, she decided that she wanted to remain a United States citizen since she was a natural born one, or native born it is. And so she went before the consulate in Stockholm and affiliated herself with the citizenship of the country where she was born, and which gave her dual citizenship. And when she returned to the United States and earned her living being a maid in various places. And suddenly the State Department decided that they were tired of dual citizenship. It was a nuisance, and they were going to, I guess, legalize it out of existence. So they were going to deport her, saying that she was indeed not a citizen of the United States and she was not entitled to stay. And so my boss took her on as a pro bono case, and the case was brought before the Supreme Court, and he argued this case in the Supreme Court when, at the time that Robert Jackson was the Solicitor General of the United States, and Robert Jackson lost.
Did you go to the case?
I did. I had the privilege of working on the brief that Henry Butler, who was the attorney, used, and I heard the trial, yes.
What was your impression of the arguments, both sides?
One of the things that I remember and hope is still true is the civility of the whole procedure. The arguments were legal and intellectual, and they were not vicious. They were not personalized.
Did Mr. Butler have any impression of Robert Jackson? Did he talk about his opposition?
Not that I remember. Not that I remember. I think he was probably the one who told me that, on the whole, Mr. Jackson's heart was on our side.
Did your extensive career here at Chautauqua, did your paths ever cross with Jackson's at all?
My husband had met him, and at some point our paths did cross, and I met him, and we had some few minutes of conversation. And, this was when he was Attorney General, I think.
Wow, that's kind of a fun story. If you had to close your eyes and describe what Jackson looked like, since I never met him, could you?
I could now because I've seen his picture so recently. Otherwise, I think I might have been challenged to do that. It would have been a little difficult. I remember him, my picture of him in the Supreme Court was one of great dignity, I think. He argued his case with I don't know, it's just sort of a gentle kind of logic.
I do remember him just, as a child, because I saw him after that too, when he'd come back and visit, et cetera. But, his close friend, was George Niebank, Sr. And George Niebank, Sr. was Uncle George and Aunt Rose to me. I mean, they were my parents' very closest friends, because my dad was on the board of the old Bank of Jamestown and on the board of one of the two banks that they put together there that failed. The bank holiday came, and George Niebank was a young bank examiner from Niagara Falls at that time, and was sent in here to work on the Jamestown problems. And what are we going to figure out? What are we going to do? And that particular thing, they put together that bank and raised a little more capital. I imagine it was very difficult to raise any, because who had any? Sure. But they raised a little bit more. And I'm not sure my dad, I know my dad was very much involved, but he was an original director of what became the Bank of Jamestown, and they hired George Niebank to be the CEO of the new combined bank. And so my dad and Niebank became, and Jackson was also a director, and he was also attorney for the bank, for the combined bank, and he was the attorney, I believe, for making it all happen, whatever he had to do with the regulatory folks.
We have some letters to that effect.
Yeah, I mean, so he played that role. In fact, he continued to be a director of the bank even after he went to Washington for a while. I think he stayed on the board of the telephone company too. But I was saying when he would come back, look, I can remember him being in our house, Jackson, and but I can't remember him as being much fun. Very, very intense and very bright, clearly, but kind of strict. Children were meant to be seen but not heard, and that sort of thing. And George Niebank was very much the same way. I mean, that's just the way they were. But when the Jackson finally really moved, sold his place in Jamestown, really became part of the Washington scene and is going to be permanent, not just another client sort of thing. I can remember one conversation that maybe I was a little bit old, 7 or 8, but I was old enough to remember this. I remember my father, whoever he was talking to at that time, said, well, that guy's a traitor. He's gone and cast his lot with the enemy.
That being Roosevelt?
Being Roosevelt and Company. Because all of them, especially after he was in Washington, not when he was in the Supreme Court. I don't think that ever happened later, but for a few years there, I mean, he'd be up here quite frequently because he had these board meetings to go to and so on. And there'd be some kind of family weekend affair, either at the Niebanks or the Andersons or the Sportsman's Club.
You go to the Sportsman's Club when he came back up here? He was still I know he was a member.
Yeah.
Did he keep his membership?
Well, we would do one of those Sunday things. We did more of that now that back then than we do now, where families would be up there. And of course another one that he stuck with was the Union Club. You familiar with that? Well, that's think of Union League in New York. This is the Union Club, which is defunct long since. But in the hotel, Jamestown, they built up on the mezzanine on the second floor a kind of a private club place for the real movers and shakers of town, and it was something that nobody was supposed to know about. And they go up, and the unions thought that these guys would get together and sort of agree on what they were and weren't going to do in the next round of negotiations, and that kind of stuff, which they didn't. It later on became kind of a social party kind of a thing, but for in its earlier days, these guys, when they could do it, that's where they went and had lunch. And they play cards, but that's where they sort of talked about what's going on around town. And Jackson was part of that.